Inner Voice, a heartfelt chat with Dr. Fujan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Inner Voice podcast. It's so great to be with you today. I'm Dr. Fujan Zain. I'm a psychotherapist, author, and the originator of the awareness integration theory. Our heartfelt chat is about what matters most in our lives: our minds, our thoughts, feelings, actions, relationships, and our fulfillment in this beautiful journey of life. For all of you beautiful people who have been asking about our latest books and seminars, just wanted to share some of the information with you. The seminar that is coming up for therapists and life coaches is going to be February 10th to 12th, the weekend, which is on Zoom. And I would love to have the therapists or life coaches who want to learn the awareness integration theory and have that, do that with their client and bring it as a form of intervention or treatment into what they do best already. We have gotten amazing results reducing depression and anxiety. This is an evidence-based. We've done a lot of different research as in a self-help level or in a therapeutic level and a coaching level. And I'm sure that if you are a therapist or a coach, you will really, really gain a lot of amazing tools to be able to work with your client, actually. Now, side by side with that, the book that is out, it has been out for a while, and I've gotten raging reviews. It's Awareness Integration Therapy, Clear the Past, Create a New Future, and Live a Fulfilled Life Now. It was forwarded by Jeffrey Zeig. And you have a lot of different masters in theories talk about this book and talk about the awareness integration theory, which is very, very helpful. It's a structured, multi-dimensional, theoretic, and I brought a lot of the different theories together and interventions to be able to help people very quickly. We are going to launch a Fujan app any week right now, and obviously when therapists and coaches are certified in this model and method, their name will also be in the app, and people who are utilizing the app as a self-help model can come in and utilize a coach and a therapist when it's needed and they really like this mirroring effect or wanted to go deeper in those work. So I really, really recommend that. A book that is a little bit more tangible for what we're going to be talking today, which was written by my colleagues and I, Intentional Parenting, a Practical Guide to Awareness Integration Theory. It was written by two of my amazing colleagues, Dr. Nicole Jafari and Dr. Eileen Manukian, which their expertise is in education of young children and children all the way to adult. We take actually every single chapter toward a particular age group and go over all the cognitive, motor skills, emotional skills. All of that is natural and normal, and you can look at the functioning that way and also look at some of the concerns or difficulties that maybe parents have or educators have, and also look at the whole path through the awareness integration theory so you can create a practical guide for each age group through the awareness integration theory of how to discipline, how to move forward, and support to not only teachers, parents, grandparents who work with children. So this is an amazing book for that group, and I really, really suggest it. It's an easy read, although it has a lot of scientific background, but it's an easy read. In this episode, I chat with Dr. Bibi Pirayesh. She holds a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and education from the University of Pittsburgh and a master's degree in developmental psychology from Columbia University, where her work focused primarily on children's development of mathematical thinking and cognitive neuroscience. She's worked as a learning specialist and educational therapist in private practice for over a decade. While the emphasis of her work is on remediating learning disabilities in a one-on-one setting, she is also a sought-after speaker and community advocate for children and families around learning rights. She works with children grades 1 to 12 and covers a wide range of learning difficulties, including dyslexia, ADHD, and the spectrum disorders. In 2020, Dr. Pirayesh launched the Difference is Not Deficit project to help promote the importance of seeing learning disability as a social justice issue, and cornerstone of her doctorate dissertation was that. In addition to her private practice and advocacy work, she is also adjunct faculty at Pepperdine University Graduate School of Education and Psychology. Please connect with her via her website, One of a Kind, One of One Kids, www.oneofonekids.org. Subscribe to this podcast and my YouTube channel and connect with me through my website, foujanzane.com, or any of the other social medias. If you like self-help books, then I really, really suggest for you to get Life Reset, which is the awareness integration path to create the life you want. In this book, you'll go through the process and you can journal and in different areas of life, almost 21 different areas of life, where you could really get amazing awareness and even the process of integration through just journaling. And we've created amazing results on those. And that's why after this, we went to Foujan app, which will be launching any day. And I will let you know as soon as possible. So I want to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you. So share with me everything that you need, and I will either have the expertise and talk about that subject, or I'll share with other experts to come in and share them with you. So one of those experts who we're going to chat with today is Dr. Bibi Pirayesh. There she is. Well, welcome to this show, Bibi Pirayesh. It is so nice to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Today, let's talk about something that you are an expert in, and that is working with children who might have some vulnerabilities as far as learning. And I think this is one of the scariest things that parents go through. They don't know. Many times I've worked with parents where they're scared, but they also kind of try to justify it. And they'll, as a parent, we don't want to find anything wrong with our children. So even if we think there's something that is not up to par, or that they need support, or that something's going on, obviously the first thing is I'm going to go to the pediatrician, I'm going to find out, and I'll kind of do I'll talk to the teachers, and then I'll kind of do this kind of like comparative aspect with the age group that maybe my child is going through, and whether they're up to par with everybody else. But I've also says that although many of the parents that I work with do this, there is a place of denial, and I don't want to see it, don't tell me, and they'll go through a justification, which it doesn't help their children, because the sooner that the child is diagnosed and treated, many of these issues can be handled much faster. And we're talking about learning disabilities, or sometimes they have issues, but the issue is not actually a learning disability, but they might have can't hear well, or can't see well, or can't comprehend well, or they're in a spectrum. And those are all the different angles that an anxious parent wants to know, wants to fix it, but sometimes just also avoids it. So can you share with us your view and your experience on this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you have it exactly right. I think that for a lot of parents, there's a great deal of anxiety, but also a great deal of shame associated with the idea of getting a learning disability diagnosis for their child. And I think one of the main reasons for that, and I think that a lot of it, is also culturally dependent. And so we have to be very aware of kind of the cultural background that people come from. But one of the main reasons is that learning disability has been very wrongly kind of associated with or equated with intelligence or IQ. And it's not at all. So, kind of dismantling that myth is one of, I think, the biggest jobs that those of us who are in education and in psychology have, because one reason that, parents are concerned is that they think, oh, they're going to put a label on my child, and it's going to mean that they're not smart enough and they're not going to be able to succeed. So that's one aspect. Another aspect that I find a lot is that, some learning disabilities run in families, like ADHD, for example. And, we're in a generation and a time now where it's been to it's much more destigmatized than it used to be. We know a lot more and understand a lot more. That is usually not the case for the generations who are having children right now. And so, many times I find that parents went through their entire lives without a diagnosis. And so it's such a sore point for them, such a point of vulnerability and shame just in their own experience. And they want to prevent their child from going through that same experience. And so, that's sort of where some of their hesitation comes from. And of course, it actually, when you go through the process, it actually ends up being exactly the opposite, because what tends to happen is when they're able to allow their child to actually get their diagnosis and get the support that they need and, go through the process, it ends up being very healing for the parents. I've had parents cry, saying, if I had the support when I was younger, my life would have been completely different, because so many of them just kind of powered through and survived their schooling years and still continue to struggle in their everyday life, not realizing that they could have gotten some of these supports. So, there's kind of a combination, I think, and this is why anytime I work with a child, it's really family work. Because the learning disability of the child impacts everyone, and then everything in the family environment impacts the learning of the child. So it's really important to kind of take all of these things into consideration. And, for many parents, it's a journey. With some people, I just know that, okay, well, we're going to begin right now. We're not going to call it anything. We're not going to label it. We're not going to tell the school if that's where we're at. And then, we're just going to work. We're just going to support the student. We're going to remediate. And then as the process goes through and the parents are able to see the shifts that happen for a student as a result of that support, slowly they're able to come to terms with, okay, well, I can understand why, if we had a diagnosis, it would be so much easier to get accommodations, for example, through the school system. And that would make my child's experience, and as a result, my experience, so much easier. So, you have to let people arrive at that place themselves. And they often do. I've occasionally had, situations, especially in situations where maybe parents are going through a divorce, where one parent just is in complete denial and refuses to even engage. So occasionally things like that happen, but for the most part, if you recognize that adults and parents have their own process to go through, we usually are able to move in the right direction.
One of the situations that I've come to a lot of times is that parents hold the shame and hold the stigma. They really blame themselves. They really start looking at, what have I done? Is it my genetics? Is it that I did something wrong, while I was pregnant? And then, sometimes the parents is like, oh, it was from your side. No, it wasn't. It was from your side. So the blame goes back and forth. These are all the conditions that are they're kind of normal. Like we as human beings just go through this normal process until we come to an acceptance. Sometimes I've watched parents say, we're going to get privately treated, but I don't want the schools or the teacher to know because I don't want anything to be in their in their record, whether it's the educational record or the medical record. And unfortunately, the child might not be able to get the best medical advice, nor they might get the best services from school if everything is being done in a hush-hush level. The other side of it is that the child themselves get into the stigma because it's as if like there's something wrong with them and they have to be hush hush and it has to be secret and they have to show up another way in front of their peers while they're struggling. So actually coming to terms with this and moving along with treatment is such a healthier way for the parents and the child, especially since it doesn't only affect that child and the family, it also affects all the siblings because they're treating one child very differently and they're asking all of the other children in the family to treat that child in a different way. And sometimes they also hold the shame versus, like, oh, my sibling, there's something wrong with one of my siblings. And they hold this shame and they have to hold the secret even when they go out or they're with their friends. While if this concept is handled as there's no shame, every one of us have some vulnerabilities, and we can learn how to cope with it. We can learn how to manage it. We can learn how to, despite the vulnerability, grow in so many different layers. And I think coming to terms with that for the family, for the parents, are so crucial. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. The bottom line is, without getting too deep into, the cultural values and ideologies that create such shame around disability, the bottom line is that there is a grieving process, and there's a grieving process for the child, there's a grieving process for the parent. And as you said, with the siblings, we know there's a great deal of research, for example, that shows if you have a diagnosis of something like, an autism spectrum disorder, the impact of that on the siblings, because now the child that has that diagnosis is getting all of the parental attention and time, and the impact of that on the other kids. So there's definitely a grieving process all around. And unfortunately, in our school system, or even in, the medical system, or with psychologists, I think tend to do a better job. But generally speaking, in the school system, we don't talk about that enough. So, when a child is tested and diagnosed, and there's like an IEP meeting where everyone sits down for goals and all of that, it's very rare that someone says, okay, this is going to be having a big impact on all of you as the family members. So what are the services that we're going to look at for that? I mean, the expectation is not at this point for the school system to provide those services. We can barely get them to provide the necessary services for students. But at least the acknowledgement of that and a conversation around that, I think, is super important, but always missed. And, there's some learning disabilities that are more, something like, for example, dyslexia is not the correct term, but like something that falls under a specific learning disability, like in math or in reading or whatever it is. If there's no comorbidity with anything else, that tends to be somewhat more manageable because it's very specific to a task, even though, of course, if there's a reading issue, it has a huge impact. But then there are other things like ADHD or autism, which are just so pervasive in the everyday life of the student that they impact every aspect of the family's life as well. And it's just very rare that we have that conversation. So yes, I think recognizing grief, recognizing that everyone deals with grief differently. So like you said, some people immediately jump to kind of blaming the other side's genes or whatever it is, we all go through our grieving process differently. But one of the major things that I try to do in my work with families is to get them to understand that this is not some horrible thing that's happened or some unfortunate thing that they need to work through. Rather, it's an incredible opportunity for taking a pause and unpacking and addressing and feeling and acknowledging and learning how to communicate. I mean, it's a really, if we take it for the opportunity that it is, I think anytime anyone in a family system brings forward a difference, any kind of difference sort of from the norm, that provides an incredible lens into that family system and into ourselves and our past and our experiences. And so it really sort of becomes our job to take that on and to see it as something positive as opposed to something unfortunate or negative. So I think how you view it also makes a difference.
One of the diagnoses that has been rising, obviously, autism spectrum has, but side by side, I think ADHD has been especially for children. And I think there's a confusion sometimes where teachers tend to kind of pseudo-diagnose ADHD in their room much faster because of seeing some of the signs. But parents sometimes they don't really know whether this is a child who just is high strung. They're very intelligent. They get bored fast in the class. The schooling system and the class, the way it's being taught just doesn't capture their attention. So part of losing attention and having all of this amazing energy that's there needs to go somewhere, but they're being taught to just sit down and do it this way, and they can't, so they get irritated. They won't, all of that. Another one is that they're very anxious, and part of not paying attention, losing memory, not focusing, all of that is because they just have such a high anxiety that they're consistently dealing with what's going on inside, and they lose the attention from outside. And then we also see some of the families say, okay, this might be ADD or ADHD, but when we're actually doing the test, we see that it isn't as high anxiety. What are your suggestions to some of the parents that are in our audience and how to deal with their child that it might seem like they have some symptoms of ADD or ADHD? And if you could share with us some of those symptoms, it could be something that they could be looking for. And then if obviously they're very young or that they're coming to their adolescent, but we have parents who really just don't want to utilize medication because they just don't agree with it. They don't think that their child, we could do behavioral therapeutic interventions. And what is it that they can do in order to, one, do the accurate and correct diagnosis, and then, whether if they don't want to go through the medication route, what are the other possibilities?
Yeah, I mean, so ADHD is, I think it's probably the most complex and difficult of all the learning disabilities to both diagnose and to treat. There is an incredible amount of misdiagnosis, one, because of all the different things that can present as ADHD, for example, an auditory processing disorder or trauma, all sorts of things can kind of create similar symptoms to ADHD. So that's one reason. The other reason is that, a lot of people are under the misconception that, we have some very exact way of measuring and diagnosis. Like, we can go into the brain and take a picture of it and say, oh, here's an ADHD brain versus this other brain. And that's not how the diagnosis happens at all. It happens through, basically asking everyone in the child's environments questions. And, people are filling out questionnaires and surveys, and obviously there's an observational component, with the diagnostic or the diagnostician and the child, but it's still really so much dependent upon kind of the symptoms that are being presented. So, and anytime you have something like that, it's difficult. And so one person can take all of that data and interpret it one way, and someone else can take that data and interpret it a different way. And then, of course, there's the issue of, the fact that we ask children essentially in the school system, especially in the elementary years, we really ask them to do something that's quite unnatural for them, which is to sit quietly, don't speak, sit in I have my own critiques of the education system and all the ways that it in fact, kills the curiosity and the joy of learning in children. And for boys especially, that tends to be really difficult. But with all of that said, and I know that this, there's a great deal of controversy around, is ADHD really even a real thing, or is it a result of our modern day and, technology and all of these things? And I think all of those discussions are valid. However, as someone who has observed children who truly struggle with, essentially ADHD is also misunderstood as an attention disorder, but it's really an executive function disorder. It's the inability to be able to essentially feel and know yourself in time and space. And so, as someone who's worked with real cases of that, I can say that it's very much, regardless of how we decide to talk about it, it's definitely a very real experience for the person that is struggling with it. And I also understand the hesitation around medication. That's another thing that I think we really have to be mindful about, where parents are, and allow them to, again, go through their own process. Medication doesn't work for every single ADHD student. For the ones that it does work for, it can be a complete day and night experience. But it doesn't work for everyone. For some students, it works a little bit, but then there's so many side effects that it's really not worth it. So it really is one of those things that you have to go on a case-by-case basis. And the medication is also, it's a very exact art and science. Parents have to work with someone who's really willing to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until they find the just right cocktail, so to speak, for that particular student, because everyone's brain chemistry is so different, and all the other components in their life are contributing factors. So it's I think that dealing with kids who have that diagnosis really requires just an despite its prevalence, an extra level of understanding. And there are some non-pharmaceutical, kind of more herbal medications that there's some research behind, and I encourage parents to try all the different routes, but because it is a process, it's really a process of coming to understand yourself and your child. But because I have also been able to see the way that pharmaceutical medication can make such a huge difference for some children, I would never say, no, it's just completely wrong, or, don't do that. But I understand the larger critiques around, people's hesitations. I completely do. But I think that, the way that I approach it is, how does this feel for the child, and where is the child's functionality, and what do we need to do to best support that? An ADHD medication is actually one that has been on the market for a very long time. There's a lot of research behind it. We know that it's not something that stays in the body, so you can always try it. If it doesn't work, you can take your child off of it, and move forward in a different direction as well. So I don't think that we need to have as much anxiety around medication as we do. But on the other hand, I also think that we have to have a healthy degree of skepticism when you take your child in and they just do like a solo ADHD diagnosis, which you should never do. They should always do a comprehensive evaluation to rule out other things that could be presenting as ADHD, and then immediately putting the child on medication. I had a case very recently where there was a diagnosis of ADHD, but there was also a diagnosis of a mood disorder. And, this child had been on ADHD medication for, the majority of her life. And that was really negatively impacting her mood and her mood disorder. So that's why it's so important that we look at everything as a whole and we never just kind of treat one part. And I think, unfortunately, that's one of the things that gets missed a lot as well.
I also think that the parents who have a child that is possibly diagnosed as ADHD have to learn a lot of their own behavior modification and how they create and set up the structure of home. I've watched the parents say, okay, if the child was diagnosed and finally on a medication, their expectation is, all right, then all should be fine. Or the other side of it is they go into this powerlessness that it creates inability or that enables the child to do some behaviors that are can be definitely shifted, but they're not necessarily working with it because they're kind of not justifying it. So I've watched either one area is shaming them, making them bad and wrong, and kind of like powerless against, what am I going to do? You're never going to get better. Or it's enabling whatever they do. It's like, it's okay. It's just their ADD. Yeah. And I think parents have a lot to do with how do they create a structure of learning for a child who has ADD, such as it's very common for a child who has ADD that they lose focus. So they go in the kitchen and they open all the cupboards and then they let it go. Or they're doing something and in the middle of it, they just drop it and they go somewhere else. So you have either a parent that is like yelling and screaming and shaming and all of that, or someone, it's okay, it's just their ADD. So I just wanted to give an example of how sometimes this works. And it doesn't, you don't need to shame them. I get it that for a lot of parents, this is very frustrating to live with someone who does these things and they forget, to turn off the light or do a lot of different things. I've had clients who, they've grown up with ADHD. So as they're like a teenager, they left the key in the car and in the front of the house. And the parents are yelling and screaming about, how could you do that? Like, we were so lucky that, somebody didn't just come and steal it. So there's a lot that goes on. And yet, I think that if the parents also get trained in how to create some of those behavioral shifts with and condition their children as they're growing up, and how to pay attention, how to create structures. So yes, this is part of their vulnerability, but that doesn't mean that behaviorally, if somebody gets trained in them and practices them, that it doesn't work for them, because ultimately, as an adult who needs to work with other people, who's going to have their own family, who are going to have, to be in corporate structure or business structures, they need to learn these skills. And these skills don't just show up with medication. It will show up because the parents are aware and they're not only training themselves, but creating structure in the whole household to create that training.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that's the other thing. Even for the kids where medication is like a miracle drug, it is never enough on its own. It really has to be a combination. There has to be, in my opinion, educational therapy, other types of therapies if needed. And that's really, I think, the trickiest thing with ADHD is that it really requires a family-based approach to intervention, because it really is about all the systems that are in place or not in place that create the possibility for success or not. And, like I said earlier, a lot of times because ADHD runs in families, you have parents who themselves have ADHD, and so they struggle with a lot of those systems. And, that's even more reason to get support. They say that, people with ADHD do really well in the Army because they respond so well to that very strict structure. And that's essentially, what you need to create for them. And then what you need to slowly teach them to create for themselves, because you're exactly right. The goal is always around functionality. The goal of parenting, I think, is to raise a child that can go off on their own and, be able to function and be a contributing member of society and live a life that's based around their own well-being, etc. So I think that's always a good gauge is, if I'm shaming and blaming, or if I'm just like enabling and letting it go, what is this going to look like for this person when I'm no longer in the picture? And I think that's a huge component of it. And I think ADHD, again, is especially frustrating because the most sort of like basic commonsensical things that we expect from another human being is sometimes missing. So basically the ability to plan the simplest things, the ability to, sort of think to yourself, okay, I have to be out the door in the morning by this time. There's no way that I can wake up 10 minutes before and be ready. Like just sort of like basic stuff doesn't quite work with the ADHD brain. And so really recognizing, I think, for parents that this is in fact for lack of a better term, a brain disorder or a difference that really prevents this person from functioning. And it's not to make them mad, it's not them misbehaving, it's not them being lazy. I think sometimes just that paradigm shift can be really difficult. But I always think parents who are dealing with a child with ADHD are, what they're practicing more than anything else is patience. And again, kind of along the lines of trying to see it as something positive, try to see it as this is an opportunity for me to practice patience and not lose my mind right now. And of course we do sometimes, and that's okay. And that's expected, but to constantly remember that this is not a typical brain that is just trying to make life difficult for you. This is a differently wired brain that is truly struggling with some of these, basic things, I think can help.
Dr. Bibi Naz-Pirayesh, everyone. Bibi, you have launched the Difference is Not Deficit project. Can you share a little bit about that project? You launching it in 2020, and what does the project do? What do people need to know about it?
Sure. I mean, that really came out of, as you remember, 2020 is when we all went into lockdown, and then all of a sudden overnight teachers had to figure out basically how to do schooling on Zoom. And children had to learn how to do that as well. And in many ways, I think that had some positive impacts for the disability community. Of course, people with disabilities had been, advocating for things like working from home or access, or, having all of the things that a student needs in one place online. That's something that I had been advocating for forever. And it was always like, no, we can't do it. It's impossible. But somehow overnight, we all figured out how to do it in the pandemic. But, the other component of it that was really, difficult, of course, was how much that isolated everyone. And, generally speaking, for kids with learning disabilities, what we always encourage is a sort of multi-sensory approach. And one of the things that happens on Zoom or on computers is you basically cut off, so many of the senses. And so you're kind of really functioning in this virtual two-dimensional odd world. And that has a huge impact on learning. And then, of course, the other side of it, which you would know about even more than I, is the mental health component. I was seeing so many of my students really struggling with their mental health, with the isolation, with the lack of all the learning that happens as a result of just being around other human beings, other kids, etc. And then so many of the experiences that people were having around, diagnosis, around difficulties in school, all of that was happening in isolation. So every family that I was working with was going through it, but everyone assumed that they're the only ones that are struggling like this. Like, they couldn't understand that, no, actually everybody is struggling like this. So, the project really grew out of a desire to get people to share those stories and to speak with one another, and to kind of understand that they're not alone. There's actually quite a big community of us that are all struggling with this, but doing it in isolation. So that was a huge push behind it. And then the other push was, kind of because so many other things were happening in the larger culture at the time around systems, what was happening, for example, with George Floyd, and everything that happened as a result of that, and kind of our larger political structures. And it was really a time where I felt like people had the capacity to reflect on these questions, these very important questions around how much of it is my disability and how much of it is me being disabled by the system that I have to function in. And I think those are really important questions in education. Those are really important questions in mental health and psychology. And so that was sort of another big push behind this project, is to sort of reflect on and think about, okay, well, what if the system was able to adjust to me in the ways that I needed? What would that be? How would that be different for me? And what have been my experiences where I really was held back because of the expectations of a system that could have been a lot more flexible, but isn't being more flexible?
That with ADD and ADHD, because when the school systems get to know that this is the issue, a lot of them try to accommodate with timing, with extending the test hours, dealing with people one-on-one, which has really created a lot more of success for people who were diagnosed with ADD or ADHD.
Absolutely. And it was very interesting because before the pandemic, I would consistently be trying to advocate for some of these things for students. Like, this is an ADHD child, like, could we just not have these deadlines with these like huge penalties if they don't meet the deadlines? And a lot of the time the answer was no, especially in a lot of private schools where they're not required by law, I guess, to adhere to some of these things. But then what happened with the pandemic is that suddenly we were all in a way disabled. And so I feel like that kind of shifted things, like, oh, okay, so all of the schools were like, we understand we're all going through this, so no deadlines, just as long as you get it in by the end of the semester. And that was huge. That was huge for so many students. And I just think that, the pandemic provided such an important moment in time for all of us to be able to be more empathic and to kind of walk in the shoes of what the experiences of atypical learners or neurodiverse people is like a lot of the times, and to have more sympathy and understanding around that. So yeah, that was another big push behind the project.
Beautiful. Anything we haven't shared that you really want our audience to know?
I mean, I think, to me, it's the most important thing when it comes to these things is trust your guts, don't be scared, educate yourself, get support, and know that it's going to be okay. There is no reason for all the shame and stigma around I mean, any disability, but, learning disability, since that's what that's where my work is, because it's perfectly possible to live a happy, functioning, very successful life. The more you understand it, the better, and pushing it away, that's just going to create more problems. So that would be my big kind of message, if I can have one.
Where can people find you, Dr. Pirayesh?
Sure. I tend to be pretty active on LinkedIn, so that's usually a good way to get a hold of me. And then all of my information is on my website, which is www.oneofOnekids.org. On my social media, phone, email, and all of that is on there.
And do you do testing and evaluation for children? Or no?
I don't do like a full, I'm not a neuropsychologist, so I don't do a full evaluation. I do with every child, I do a screening. A lot of times parents come in and they're like, we don't really know if there is a reason to get testing, and we don't want to invest in a $5,000 test or to go through this whole process with the public school system. There are, screenings that you can do for, that take a lot less time and are much more affordable, that basically give you information on, yes, move forward with testing, or this is something you need to look at more, or no, there's really no processing issue going on, so let's talk about what else might be causing these issues. So that's kind of a regular part of my practice. But, because my practice is so much through sort of word of mouth, a lot of the students who come to me already have a diagnosis, but that is not at all, the way that it needs to be. I think a lot of people are just very blank and have no idea. They just know that, they're screaming and pulling their hair around homework time, and want to understand a little bit more. So I offer those screenings as a way to help guide parents. But for a full evaluation, I always refer to either the school system, depending on the circumstances, or a neuropsychologist.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me in our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving airtime to this really, really important topic and issue. And as a fellow Iranian woman, of course, I always want to end with Zan Zendagi Azadi, as we're in the midst of this other, huge movement that is impacting, I think, students in Iran to such a large extent. And my heart is with them every single day. So
proud of them every time I see such a young group, even as young as elementary school or junior high, definitely high school, and of course college students and young adults are out there. The movement started with women. That's why the saying is women, life, and liberty. It started with women, and very soon, men joined, and, we're rooting for them, we're there for them, we bring their voice to the world, and, hopefully soon we will share their freedom in Iran and for them and across the world. So yes, absolutely. And thank you for opening that up again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
So everyone, please connect with Dr. Pirayesh. Her promise is her book next year, so we're going to have her back. Her book is launched. So thank you. Take care, good care of yourself, and thank you for doing all you do, Dr. Pirayesh.
Thank you. Likewise.
And for all of you who are out there, create an amazing life for yourself and everyone around you. And until next week, bye-bye.